So having dominated the early years of the industry, by 1908, production companies found that the industry had expanded not only beyond their expectations, but also beyond their control. And at a point when demand for new films was increasing exponentially, because people loved the film industry, especially from about 1905, 1906, when film moved from basically being collections of what were called actualities, which was basically just shooting reality, into what was called the story mode of films, so narrative films, fiction-based films. And people like Edison, I suppose in particular, felt that the majority of industry profits were not being earned by people like him, the producers or the film manufacturers, but were instead being earned by the exchanges and the exhibitors, by the cinemas. Obviously Edison isn't particularly happy about this. So producers, and Edison in particular, sought to try and reassert their control over the industry. Edison wasn't interested in getting rid of competition because the demand for films was so great from the audiences that Edison knew that his company alone could never potentially or possibly fulfill that demand. Rather, what Edison wanted to do was try and control the industry, to regulate it at not just the level of production, but also the level of exchanges and exhibition. And the mechanism that he chose for doing so was to assert his legal control of the patents required not just for film production, but also for film exhibition. Having been awarded a patent for the kinematograph back in 1897, Edison immediately began suing those companies that he perceived to be using a version of his technology. And the key legal battle here was against Dixon's American Mutoscope and Biograph Company, or just the Biograph Company. However, because Dixon had contributed substantially to the original design of Edison's camera, when he had come to make his own camera with the Biograph Company, Dixon had been very careful to avoid the specifications of the Edison patent. And so in 1901, Edison's lawsuit against Biograph for infringing his camera patent was rejected by the court. But Edison appealed that decision the following year, 1902, and the appeals court did basically find in his favour. But crucially, the appeals court also found that Edison's original patent for a motion picture camera was too broad, was too broadly defined, and that it would need to be redefined and thus would need to be reissued. And this occurs in September 1902. Edison reissued his patent in basically two parts for two things he was patenting. One was for a camera and one was for the film stock that was specific to that camera, 35mm film. And then Edison begins a whole new wave of lawsuits against those that he perceived to be infringing his patents. His main target here is the Biograph Company. But in March 1907, a circuit court found that because the Biograph Company used a different mechanism to move film through a camera, that the Biograph camera was not infringing Edison's patent. But that case did bring indirectly some good news for Edison, because the Biograph Company were actually using two cameras to make their own films, the Biograph camera and also the Warwick camera, which was a UK manufactured camera. And the circuit courts found that the Warwick camera did infringe Edison's patent, even if the Biograph camera itself, the Biograph's own camera, didn't. And since basically virtually all other, in fact probably all other US film manufacturers and production companies were using cameras that were similar in design to the Warwick camera, the case effectively established Edison's right to demand that those other film producers, and that meant virtually every other film production company in the country, pay him in order to use his technology. So in January 1908, Edison licensed the largest US production companies to use his technology. This is the Kalem Company, Selig, SNA, Vitagraph, and Lubin. And he also licenses two of the largest French companies, Pathé Frères and Georges Méliès. Those licenses allowed those companies to make films under the Edison patents. It also required that those companies agree not to sell their films to exchanges below minimum price levels. So Edison is trying to control what he saw as wasteful price competition between production companies. He's trying to set a minimum price below which film production companies would not sell their films to exchanges. So Biograph is the only major film production company in America which is not licensed and does not become part of what we can think of as the Edison combination or the Edison combine of companies. As such, the Edison licensed companies constituted a near monopoly of the US film industry. And Edison and the licensees then moved to exploit this market power at the level of production to exert influence over the middleman, the film exchanges. The Edison Combine began to license film exchanges to receive product from the licensees. The deal was that licensed exchanges agreed only to take films from Edison and his licensees. And that, of course, froze out other production companies, such as Biograph, who now could not distribute their films via the film exchanges, which were licensed to the Edison companies. Furthermore, the exchanges had to submit to new regulations imposed by Edison and the other licensees. These included agreeing to a minimum rental prices for films. That is, exchanges when renting films out to exhibitors agreed not to drop the prices below certain set minimums. And also a requirement that prints should be returned to the film producers after a fixed period. And the intention here was to make sure that worn-out prints didn't continue in circulation long after their sell-by date. Exchanges who signed up to the Edison combination became known as the Film Service Association. Despite this, and despite the fact that they were alone, the Biograph company was legally and commercially in a position to stand up against the Edison companies, the Edison combination. It had legal immunity from the Edison camera patent, and it was a bigger producer of films than any of the Edison licensees, with the possible exception of Vitagraph. And there were plenty of exchanges who were not happy with the new rules the Edison combination was attempting to impose upon them, and who were willing to ally with Biograph. And then, of course, there was also that group of importers of foreign films which had been frozen out by Edison. They too were happy to ally with Biograph. And finally, Biograph had strong financial backing because it had strong connections with Wall Street. And so in February 1908, Biograph effectively begins a war with Edison, a war that will be fought on the battleground of patent rights. And he begins to, or the company begins to, Dixon and the Biograph company, begin to acquire patents that will act as a kind of a counterweight to Edison's strength. On February the 9th, 1908, the Biograph company bought the Latham loop patent. They also then went on to acquire a patent from the Armat company for a projector shutter mechanism. This ensured that you got bright images screened when you projected them. And they added these to a patent that the Biograph company already owned. This was something called the Pros patent. This was very useful for reducing on-screen flicker when you were projecting. And this had been acquired, as I say, in 1903, some 5 years earlier. But in addition to this, to offer a plausible alternative to the Edison combination, Biograph had to be able to convince exchanges that he would be able to supply them with a wide variety of product, with a sufficient number of films to basically keep the cinemas around across the United States that were not associated with the Edison licensed exchanges filled with new films. This was achieved by an agreement with the US offices of a number of film importers who were mainly importing films into the United States from Europe. And by summer of 1908, this was beginning to have the desired effect. Variety reported that an increasing number of exchanges and exhibitors were being driven away from Edison and his licensees, especially by the fact that Edison had introduced a 60% increase, a 60% price hike in rental prices immediately after the establishment of the combination. Exchanges were also unhappy with the demand that prints be returned basically to film producers. And it is at this point that both Edison and Biograph begin to start firing off patent suits at one another. In 1908, Biograph bought a total of 12 lawsuits alleging infringement of the Latham loop patent and the Pros patent. For its part, Edison launched 46 lawsuits, similarly infringing patents of the Edison film camera patent and the Edison film stock patent. And so what you have is a kind of a legal stalemate. Both Biograph and Edison owned patents that the other company needed. So Biograph needed some of Edison's patents and Edison needed some of Biograph's patents. So what is the logical outcome of this? Well, basically they shake hands. They agree to cross-license one another, and they immediately thereafter establish a new basically combination, a more formal mechanism to pool their patent resources, and this is called the Motion Picture Patent Company, or also known as the MPPC.